Nationalism in Africa. On this slide, you can see the division of Africa in 1897 among the different European powers, and you can contrast that with the map on the right, which shows a much more modern view of Africa. Let's talk about how Africa went from being almost completely colonized by European nations to a series of independent states that we know today. First of all, remember that imperialism involved a combination of factors: the strong dominating the weak, the search for natural resources and to establish strategic military locations, greed and wanting more money for the home country, developing markets, and having access to workers. And let's also review the formula for independence. When you take imperialism over a long period of time, it builds frustration with the people who are being dominated, and eventually that leads to nationalism in most cases. When did the nations in Africa gain their independence? The independence movement in Africa really begins after World War II. Soldiers from these African countries fought beside European soldiers in World War II to defend their freedom. And what they wanted was freedom and independence for themselves and their own people back home. And after the war, European nations realized that these colonies were too expensive for them to continue to maintain, so they began to grant freedom to the African nations. How did the African nations gain their independence? Well, this is an oversimplification, but really you can look at two different examples that we've already studied. There's what we'll call the India model, where the nations in Africa were protesting, but that it was very nonviolent in nature, and that became a pathway to independence. And this would be the case in Ghana and Nigeria. And then we'll look at what we call the Vietnam model. And this is where opposition groups emerged, and they were fighting for their independence, often using guerrilla warfare tactics. This would be more the case in places like Kenya, Algeria, and Angola. What happened after the nations gained their independence? Well, several things. First of all, a government had to be set up. And remember that nations in Africa had had basically one of two experiences. In places where indirect colonial rule had taken place, lots of times this was true of the British Empire, people had experience governing themselves. The British may have been in control, but the local people within the country were able to serve in government and had experience with making decisions and being in charge. In places that had more direct colonial rule, and this would be more true in places that were colonized by, say, the French, the people struggled to organize governments because it had been outsiders who had been in control during the period of imperialism. Also, an economy had to be established, and this involves some really difficult things, because part of imperialism was having a country or an area focus on one or two cash crops, and a shift needed to occur from these cash crops back to more staple goods that people need to survive. They need to be able to feed themselves. They need to be able to generate products for manufacturing. In most cases, there were no factories in these countries. If you'll recall the video that we watched about Gandhi and independence in Africa, in India, one of the experts said that the Indians, by the time imperialism reached its height, didn't even have the means to manufacture a safety pin. Well, the same is true in lots of these places in Africa. They haven't been allowed to produce things for themselves, so they've got to have some means of either making or getting the manufactured goods that they need. And all this economic uncertainty makes the government less stable. People want to know that they have the basic things they need to survive, and when they don't, they start looking for a government who promises that it can be provided. And that sometimes will create a lot of chaos. This is one of the most serious things that happens after independence, and it's that different groups had to figure out how to get along, and in some cases they didn't. And what had happened was that rival groups that had different languages, different cultures, sometimes even different religious beliefs, had been forced into the same countries during imperialism. And so when they gained their independence, there's not really a monitor or supervisor to keep these rival groups in check. And so when one comes into power, they persecute the other, and vice versa. And it's a very difficult environment in which to establish a country. Also, village and community life had been disrupted by imperialism, especially in places where mines or factories had been built, and men had to leave their families and leave their homes to go work in these factories. So a lot of the community ties that make it essential to govern and to have a stable society had been disrupted through imperialism. Now, if you take one example, and this is a very simplified treatment of this example, but let's look at South Africa. South Africa began the process of gaining independence from the British in 1910. They were granted self-rule, and then several years after that, they became a Commonwealth nation. So it was a process, but it was mainly, it began in 1910, before World War I had started. What type of government took power? A constitutional government was established in South Africa that would be led by a president, but that didn't mean that there weren't problems in South Africa after independence. South Africa had racial divisions between the whites, the Afrikaners, who were Dutch descendants, and then the black South Africans. And what emerged was a system where the whites were ruling, and the blacks, who were the majority, were being discriminated against and oppressed in a system of apartheid. And this is a very strict racial segregation. It took years and years and years of fighting and protesting and sanctions by outside community of the world sanctioning South Africa to wipe out the system of apartheid and racial oppression. What are conditions like in South Africa today? Well, apartheid was outlawed in 1990, and a new constitution was written, so that today in South Africa, the majority blacks are in power and they rule the country, but they still struggle with incredible crime rates, poverty, unemployment, and a population where a number of people are facing HIV and AIDS as a medical epidemic. So the legacy of imperialism in Africa has some really serious implications today, and you'll be looking at other examples of this in class. This is the video on African nationalism. Thanks for watching. If you need to rewind or rewatch any of this video, please feel free to do so.